In 1940, a British pilot fell from the sky, his aircraft shattered, his fate uncertain. But what should have been a death sentence became the spark that changed aviation forever. From malfunctioning ejection seats to life-saving systems that now protect astronauts and fighter pilots alike. This is the untold story of courage, invention, and survival. Stay with us as we uncover the secrets hidden behind every cockpit. This is Battlefield Secrets. The century turned not with trumpets, but with the hiss of steam and the slow turning of iron gears. In foundries across Europe, metal met fire in new ways. The Industrial Revolution, once a promise of prosperity, had begun to forge something else. A new language of war written in rivets, pressure gauges, and polished steel. By the 1870s, the soldier's world was changing quietly. The rifle had become a machine. The horse still thundered across parade grounds. But the cavalry's days were numbered. Behind them, engineers were building something far faster, far more relentless. Workshops that once produced locomotives now built armored train cars, rolling fortresses of iron capable of carrying men and cannons across vast distances. The railway, once a symbol of progress, was now an artery for war. In 1884, a London-born inventor named Hiram Maxim unveiled a device that would redefine battlefields. It was small, efficient, and precise, a weapon that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute using the force of its own recoil. The Maxim gun. Observers at demonstrations watched with quiet disbelief as lines of wooden targets splintered to dust. What they witnessed was not noise or spectacle, but the beginning of automated death. Governments noticed. Contracts followed. Armies that had once measured victory in courage and discipline began to measure it in rate of fire and ammunition capacity. Industry became the new general. Elsewhere, men looked upward. The dream of flight was becoming tangible: stitched fabric wings, steam engines, and experimental dirigibles. In France and Germany, engineers competed to rise above the battlefield, to see farther, to command from the air. Among them was Henri Dupont, a lesser-known inventor whose steam-powered airship was meant to change reconnaissance forever. It rose on a winter morning over the fields near Lyon, a metal skeleton wrapped in silk and pride. Witnesses recalled the hiss of steam, the smell of oil, the shimmer of sun on brass fittings. Then came the explosion. The blast echoed across the valley, scattering fragments of ambition through smoke and flame. Dupont's work was declared a tragedy, his designs shelved. Yet years later, his diagrams would resurface in military archives, the foundation for bombers that would darken the skies of Europe in 1914. The pattern was forming, invention feeding destruction. The machine gun, the armored train, the failed airship, all born of progress, all turning toward war. In the factories, men worked long hours unaware of the transformation taking place. They shaped bolts and castings, not realizing they were building the skeleton of a future conflict. Politicians spoke of deterrence, engineers of innovation. Few spoke of consequence. By the dawn of the 20th century, the sounds of the new world were unmistakable. The grind of steel wheels, the rhythmic clatter of conveyor belts, the hum of dynamos. Nations boasted of production, of modernity, of strength. But beneath the applause of progress, a faint vibration trembled through the industrial floor, the pulse of engines waiting for purpose. The generals had not yet understood what they commanded. The scientists had not yet realized what they had created. But the machines were ready. When the first gears turned in anger, they would not stop for decades. The foundries cooled for the night, smoke settling over the chimneys like a shroud. The air hung heavy with the scent of oil and coal. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle sounded, the signal of another train departing into the dark. And in that moment, the century's heart began to beat, slow, mechanical, and merciless. The age of invention had learned to kill. In the summer of 1914, the earth convulsed, nations mobilized, borders tightened, and armies moved like tides of mud and steel. Yet above the trenches, another frontier opened, one that no soldier had prepared for. The sky, once a place of peace and weather, became a new dimension of war. At first, the flying machine was little more than a curiosity, fragile, loud, and unreliable. Reconnaissance, not combat, defined its purpose. Pilots flew low and slow, sketching enemy trenches from open cockpits while mechanics prayed their engines would hold. The Sopwith tabloid and B-2 drifted over France and Belgium like mechanical birds, their linen wings trembling in the wind. Opposite them, German Fokker Deckers rose to challenge the intrusion, each aircraft stitched together by wire and hope. What began as polite observation soon turned lethal. Pilots, passing each other in the air, began to wave, then to shoot. At first with pistols, then with rifles lashed to the fuselage. But it was the innovation of interrupter gear, a mechanism allowing synchronized fire through a spinning propeller, that changed the balance. The machine gun, once born in the mud of factories, had learned to fly. The air war over the Somme turned the sky into a shifting arena of survival. Canvas wings rattled in crosswinds, engines coughed black smoke, and tracer fire arced through the clouds like brief lightning. Pilots learned quickly or died young. The average life expectancy of a new flyer was measured not in months, but in missions. Among them was Captain Edward Mallory, a British pilot from Sussex. His aircraft, a Sopwith Pup, bore the faded insignia of his squadron, white circles over pale blue. On a morning in October, his patrol crossed enemy lines beneath a ceiling of gray cloud. Below, the land was torn open, trenches, craters, and drifting smoke. Ahead, 2 dots appeared in the distance. They grew, divided, and spiraled upward. German. The fight that followed was brief. The air itself seemed to burn. Mallory's gun jammed once, cleared, then jammed again. A burst of fire passed, so close it tore fabric from his left wing. His altimeter spun, engine screaming. And then, silence. His propeller stopped. He managed a hard landing in no man's land, the fragile aircraft collapsing into the mud. He was captured within hours. The German officer who questioned him wore the insignia of an air ace, for victories etched in silver on his collar. His name was Lieutenant Franz Kohler, a mechanic's son from Munich who had flown since the war's first month. Their meeting was not one of hostility, but curiosity. In the quiet of a field hangar, Kohler spoke of engines, of torque, of air pressure, of a new rotary design being tested by Fokker engineers. Mallory listened. He said little. But weeks later, after a prisoner exchange, the information found its way to Allied engineers. Within months, a new generation of aircraft appeared, faster, higher, more stable. The fragile equilibrium of the sky shifted once again. By late 1916, the air above Europe was no longer an open frontier. It was a battlefield without boundaries. Smoke trails and falling debris marked the sky like scars. Pilots ascended not for reconnaissance, but for dominance. Nights without armor, fighting duels that ended in fire. The transformation was complete. Beneath the clouds, soldiers still fought over yards of mud. Above them, the world had learned to kill in 3 dimensions. The airplane, once a dream of freedom, had become a weapon of precision and fear. In the chill air of evening, Mallory's squadron prepared for another sortie. Engines coughed, wings flexed, and the horizon glowed faintly with distant bombardment. He would fly again, but the world beneath him was about to burn. The Western Front was a graveyard of invention. What had begun as a campaign of movement had sunk, literally, into the mud. By 1916, the earth itself had swallowed armies. Men lived in channels carved into clay, surrounded by wire, rats, and the constant murmur of artillery. The trenches were not built to shelter life, but to contain it. The air hung thick with decay. Boots sank inches deep into brown water. Rifles rusted overnight. Soldiers learned to sleep through shell fire, to eat beside corpses, and to walk past the wounded with mechanical detachment. Above them, engines droned. Below, the ground pulsed with the tremor of distant bombardments. Amid this monotony of endurance was Lieutenant Harold Sutton, a former engineer from Manchester, now an officer of the Royal Engineers attached to the 7th Division near the Somme. Sutton had once designed ventilation systems for factories. Now he measured airflow in trenches where men gasped for breath. The war had turned his craft from comfort to survival. On a gray morning in July, the order came to advance. The air was heavy, the wind still. Sutton noticed the odd silence between shell bursts, a warning veterans recognized before they saw the green mist rising from the German lines. Chlorine gas. It moved like a living thing, rolling low over the field. curling into every depression, every dugout. The men scrambled for their issued pH gas helmets, little more than soaked fabric with crude goggles. Many tore or slipped, their filters saturated within minutes. Sutton, coughing, retreated to a sap dugout where he kept his tools, wire mesh, charcoal from spent rations, and cloth torn from a ground sheet. He worked by feel more than sight, his eyes burning, his lungs tightening. He cut, folded, and bound the pieces together into a mask that sealed around the face with string and wax. He soaked the charcoal in a solution of sodium carbonate, a method he had read about in a scientific journal before the war. Within minutes, he had 3 prototypes. He pressed one to his face, breathed, and the burning in his chest eased. The others he handed to the nearest soldiers, their eyes wide with panic. When the gas reached their trench, Sutton's improvised filters held. Those without collapsed. Those with survived. By evening, the air cleared. Bodies lay where they had fallen, pale and still. Sutton recorded the materials and measurements in his field notebook, intending to forward them to headquarters. His handwriting trembled but remained precise. 3 days later, his unit received orders to advance again. Tanks, new, rumbling beasts of steel and smoke, crawled past the trenches, crushing wire and debris beneath their tracks. The men watched in silence, half in awe, half in disbelief. The machines moved slowly, groaning, as if unsure whether they were built for war or industry. Sutton led his platoon behind one of them. The advance began before dawn. Artillery thundered. The tank ahead vanished into a cloud of mud and shrapnel. Sutton reached for his mask, but it was not gas this time. A shell landed short. The explosion threw him backward. When the stretcher-bearers found him, his field notebook was intact, tucked into his breast pocket, pages smeared but legible. Weeks later, at a field workshop near Amiens, an engineer studying captured equipment came across the notebook. Its notes matched recent experiments on activated charcoal filtration. By the year's end, every British soldier carried a mask based on Sutton's crude design. The trenches changed little. The mud remained. The shells kept falling. But in the darkness below the world's progress, one man's desperate invention had given others the chance to breathe. Above the field, the smoke lifted slowly, revealing nothing but the same broken landscape, gray, silent, eternal. His lungs failed, but his idea lived. The guns had fallen silent, but the silence was not peace. It was exhaustion. Europe, in the years after 1918, resembled a machine turned off but still warm from overuse. Nations buried their dead, dismantled their weapons, and told themselves that such a war could never happen again. Yet beneath that illusion, the gears of invention turned quietly, out of sight. The Treaty of Versailles demanded disarmament, and the world applauded its own restraint. Artillery was melted into scrap, aircraft dismantled, uniforms stored away in museum cases. The public believed the age of machines had been tempered by conscience. But behind factory walls and in silent airfields, the opposite was true. Engineers who had once built weapons now worked under different titles: industrial development, aeronautical research, experimental engineering. The language of peace concealed the persistence of preparation. In Britain, the Royal Air Force shrank almost overnight. Young officers returned to civilian life with medals that meant little and memories they could not explain. Among them was squadron leader Thomas Alden, a decorated pilot and engineer who had flown over the Somme and survived 2 crashes. The war had left him with a limp, a disillusioned faith in command, and a fascination with survival, not victory. In 1921, Alden was reassigned to a small research post at Farnborough, where remnants of the Air Ministry's experimental division remained. The hangars were quiet, their floors marked by the shadows of disassembled aircraft. There, Alden began sketching what he called a pilot's extraction harness, an early concept for a forced ejection system. It was crude: compressed air, levers, and a spring mechanism designed to throw a pilot clear of a burning cockpit. His peers considered it unnecessary. "War is over," they said. "There'll be no need to throw men out of planes again." Alden persisted. He ran wind tunnel tests, performed calculations, and even constructed a mock-up from surplus Sopwith parts. But by 1925, the project was quietly discontinued. Budgets shifted. Files were archived. The Air Ministry labeled his work as unfeasible in peacetime. Across the Channel, Germany was learning a similar lesson: to build quietly. Forbidden from manufacturing military aircraft, German engineers established civilian glider clubs, where the science of aerodynamics advanced beneath the banner of sport. Laboratories in Dresden and Kiel tested jet propulsion under university grants. The Old War had merely changed its language, not its purpose. In France, veterans gathered in cafes and spoke of sacrifice, of promises unfulfilled. Industrial towns rebuilt slowly, their factories producing tractors instead of tanks. But the metal was the same, and so were the men. Every invention meant for peace could, with minor adjustment, serve destruction again. By the late 1920s, Europe appeared stable. But the archives tell a different story: secret funding, coded correspondence, and blueprints stamped classified. Experimental aeronautics. Nations pretended to forget, but engineers remembered. Alden, retired in 1932, continued his work privately. His small workshop near Kent became a museum of failed ideas, coils, valves, and sketches yellowed by time. One document, labeled Pilot Extraction Type A, described a mechanism driven by a compressed charge, the first written description of what would later become the ejection seat. He sent it to the Air Ministry one final time. It was returned unopened, marked Project Obsolete. Outside, the world was changing again. In Germany, new leaders spoke of renewal. In Italy, factories hummed with purpose. The sky, once a sanctuary, was beginning to echo with the sound of engines again. In a quiet hangar on the edge of Farnborough, a file cabinet held Alden's blueprints. Dust gathered on the folders, the ink fading into sepia. A single line of handwriting at the bottom of one page read, "For the next war, should man ever be foolish enough to need it." No one read it. No one cared to. In a quiet hangar, a forgotten blueprint waited for fire to return. The Second War began not with speeches, but with sound: the rising hum of engines, the metallic thud of boots on hangar floors, and the shriek of sirens over London's rooftops. The silence that had followed the last great war fractured overnight. Europe was once again a forge, and Britain found itself standing at its center. Factories that had lain dormant since 1918 came alive. Windows were blacked out, assembly lines retooled, and the night sky above Coventry and Bristol glowed faintly from the heat of production. Steel, rubber, and fuel, the language of survival, returned to the nation's pulse. Engineers who had grown old in peace now worked by lamplight, drafting blueprints for machines that no one yet fully understood. At RAF Duxford, a new generation of aircraft was being tested. The Supermarine Spitfire, sleek and narrow-winged, embodied everything the interwar years had promised but never delivered: speed, maneuverability, and precision. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, once a secret of engineering pride, was now a weapon of national defense. Behind the airfields, another war was taking shape, one fought not in the skies, but in laboratories. The chain-home radar system had begun operation along the coast, its tall steel towers sending invisible pulses into the Channel air. At Bletchley Park, mathematicians and linguists worked in silence, surrounded by stacks of coded transmissions. Machines whirred, chalk scraped against boards. Every frequency, every signal mattered. Among these intersecting efforts was a small, unpublicized division within the Air Ministry known only as Section 12B, tasked with pilot emergency equipment. The term was vague by design. Inside a converted hangar near Farnborough, engineers examined an old set of drawings, the work of a forgotten man named Thomas Alden. The file had been rediscovered, yellowed but intact, as Britain rearmed in haste. Now, 2 decades after its dismissal, the concept of a pilot ejection mechanism was being rebuilt, refined with compressed gas, reinforced tubing, and a crude restraint harness. It was dangerous, untested, and strictly experimental. By late September 1939, Britain had declared war on Germany. Across the Channel, the Blitzkrieg had already begun. France trembled under the weight of armored divisions. Poland fell in weeks. For the first time since the Great War, the air itself carried the vibration of conflict. At Duxford, squadron leader Alan Merrick, aged 25, watched as his crew fueled the Spitfires lined along the tarmac. Rain tapped against the wings, pulling on the riveted metal. Mechanics worked in muffled rhythm, tightening bolts, checking propellers. Somewhere beyond the horizon, engines roared, not theirs. Merrick had volunteered for a classified equipment trial. He was to carry a new seat system installed into his aircraft, one designed to eject the pilot if the plane became uncontrollable. The engineers assured him it was safe. The paperwork said otherwise. The test was meant to be controlled, a climb, a dive, a manual activation. But war ignored plans. At dawn, his squadron was scrambled, enemy bombers approaching across the channel. The radio crackled, unreadable in bursts of static. Engines started in unison, the sound rising from the airfield like thunder. As the aircraft lifted into the mist, ground crews watched their silhouettes fade into the gray. Radar operators tracked the blips moving steadily toward one another. The first air battle of the new war had begun. Above the coast, clouds turned to smoke. Spitfires dove and climbed through arcs of tracer fire, engines screaming under strain. Merrick's aircraft banked hard to intercept a formation of Heinkel bombers. His guns jammed. His wing caught fire. Inside the cockpit, smoke filled the narrow glass canopy. The flames reached the fuselage. He reached for the lever, the prototype. Over the channel, his engine was hit, and history waited to see if he'd live. The official report described it in one line. Pilot survived ejection at low altitude. System failure, mechanical anomaly. But within that sterile sentence lay the improbable story of Flight Officer Edward Mallory, one of the few men to fall from the sky and live to tell it. By August 1940, the Battle of Britain was at its height. The sky over the English Channel was a moving tapestry of contrails and flame. Every day, RAF pilots took off knowing that half would not return. Mallory, aged 24, flew with No. 74 Squadron, based out of RAF Hornchurch. His aircraft, a Spitfire MKI, serial number P9382, carried an experimental seat assembly designed by Section 12B, a continuation of the forgotten Alden project. The modification was classified. Only Mallory and the base engineer knew of its presence. The seat was fitted with a compressed air piston and a manual release lever. It had never been tested at combat altitude. Officially, it did not exist. On the morning of August 15th, the squadron scrambled to intercept a formation of Heinkel He-111 bombers approaching Dover. Ground radar detected multiple wings moving in from Calais. Weather: poor visibility, intermittent cloud, wind from the southwest. At 10:42 hours, Mallory's flight engaged the enemy. Eyewitnesses later described a chaotic skirmish, spiraling vapor trails, tracer arcs disappearing into cloud. Mallory's wingman, Pilot Officer Briggs, recalled his leader diving into a formation and firing at close range. A return burst struck the Spitfire's undercarriage and wing root. Seconds later, black smoke trailed from the fuselage. He was hit. Engine fire, still climbing. Briggs reported over radio. Then the signal cut. The Spitfire was last seen banking over the channel, losing altitude rapidly. Flames reached the cockpit. Mallory, unable to open the canopy, pulled the emergency lever on the seat assembly. The mechanism was never designed to operate under such stress. The compressed air charge misfired. Instead of propelling him upward, the seat separated unevenly, tearing away the canopy before detonating a secondary release. The blast threw him partially clear of the cockpit at less than 800 feet, far below survivable ejection height by modern standards. He struck the air, tumbling, unconscious. His parachute deployed late, half torn by heat. Witnesses on a coastal observation post near Folkestone saw a white shape drift into the sea. Rescue boats were dispatched. At 11:23, he was recovered, alive but burned, lungs filled with seawater. His first words, according to the attending medic, were, "It wasn't supposed to work." The wreckage of his Spitfire was recovered days later from shallow water. Investigators found the ejection system fractured, its pistons fused by heat, its safety locks disengaged in the wrong sequence. The malfunction that should have killed him had, instead, thrown him clear at precisely the right angle and speed to survive. Section 12B examined the components under secrecy. What they found reshaped their understanding of pilot survivability. The uneven discharge, previously seen as a flaw, had acted as a primitive staged ejection, a two-phase release that reduced fatal acceleration. Within months, new designs incorporated that principle deliberately. Mallory's survival was treated as classified material. His name did not appear in public records. He was discharged for medical reasons in late 1941, returning to civilian life in silence. The technology he accidentally proved became the blueprint for the Martin Baker ejection systems that would save thousands in the decades to follow. The engineers called it luck. The pilots called it something else. Photographs from that day show only the wreckage: a Spitfire's wing half buried in sand, a parachute tangled in seaweed, and the faint outline of a man being lifted from the surf. The caption reads simply, "Recovered, Channel, August 1940." No one could explain how he had lived. The system had failed entirely, yet it had done exactly what it was never meant to do. His survival would rewrite the future of every pilot to come. By 1941, the war had stretched across continents, yet much of the fight remained unseen, waged not in the skies or trenches, but in the dim, humming factories of Britain. Coventry, scarred by nightly air raids, housed one such secret operation. Within its reinforced brick walls, engineers of the RAF Experimental Division worked feverishly on the refinement of pilot survival technology, devices that could, in theory, save a man from death at hundreds of miles per hour. The inspiration was Flight Officer Edward Mallory, whose improbable survival in 1940 had proven a concept, even if by accident. His ejection system had failed catastrophically, yet functioned just enough to keep him alive. Engineers now sought to turn that fluke into reliable machinery. Inside the factory, the air was thick with oil and dust. Dim overhead lamps cast long shadows across workbenches strewn with tools, springs, and compressed air pistons. Typewriters clattered as clerks transcribed field reports, detailing every nuance of prior failures. Every minor design adjustment could mean the difference between life and death. Engineer Thomas Greaves, head of the assembly team, moved between stations with precision. His hands were scarred from handling metal, his eyes red from soot and sleepless nights. "We're chasing luck," he told the younger assistants, "but luck doesn't survive in the air." Breakthroughs were rare. Prototypes were tested at Boscombe Down, where pilots volunteered, knowing that each trial could be their last. Inflatable life rafts were packed with compressed air. Pressurized cockpits designed to cushion ejection at high altitude were still experimental. Data sheets documented every bolt, valve, and piston, but one human variable remained unpredictable: the pilot. The first fatality occurred on a cold morning in March 1942. Pilot Sergeant James Larkin, age 22, ascended in a modified Spitfire fitted with the latest iteration of the ejection system. The aircraft climbed to 3,000 feet before a simulated engine failure forced Larkin to activate the seat. The mechanism fired, but the harness failed to restrain him properly. He fell into the surrounding fields, sustaining injuries that proved immediately fatal. The factory fell silent when the news arrived. No photographs were released. No names were published. Yet in the sterile aftermath, engineers sifted through the data collected from Larkin's flight: acceleration curves, harness tension, piston velocity, and canopy ejection timing. The tragedy became the blueprint for perfection. A flawed flight had revealed what no engineer's calculations alone could: the exact sequence necessary to protect a human body under extreme forces. Bombing raids intensified above Coventry, yet the factory continued. Anti-aircraft guns fired sporadically, illuminating clouds in bursts of orange. Engineers worked in a combination of fear and resolve, the muffled thuds of distant explosives becoming part of the rhythm of invention. Between projects, men would glance at the blackened streets outside, aware that the machines they were perfecting were meant to save the lives of friends, brothers, and unknown pilots yet to ascend. By late 1942, the next prototype incorporated Larkin's unintended corrections: dual-phase ejection pistons, reinforced harness restraints, and a secondary canopy release mechanism. Test flights, conducted under strict secrecy, began to show reliability. The system that had once killed would now consistently save. Letters and reports from pilots described the equipment as miraculous, but the engineers knew better. Each device carried the weight of sacrifice, the memory of the young men who had fallen so that others might live. It was engineering born of grief, refined under pressure, and measured in human lives. The next test was scheduled at dawn. The factory hummed with mechanical preparation. Outside, the city lay in shadow, scarred but resolute. Inside, the engineers paused, recognizing the stakes. The next test would decide whether man or machine held the sky. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, a mirror of steel and shadow under a clouded sky. By 1943, the war had become global, and the battlefield had grown from trenches and cities to the expanse of open water. Air power dominated the theater. British and American bomber crews carried ordnance across thousands of miles, while Japanese fighters and kamikaze attacks turned the skies into a hazard above already unforgiving sea. For the airmen, survival meant more than skill or courage. It required technology designed to keep a man alive when the sky and sea conspired against him. The Mae West Life vest, fitted with CO2 cartridges for automatic inflation, was standard issue on Allied aircraft, though still untested in many operational scenarios. Paired with compact rescue beacons and signaling mirrors, it represented the cutting edge of survival engineering in 1943. Flight Lieutenant Henry Caldwell, a British navigator aboard a consolidated B-24 Liberator, remembered the morning they took off from Espiritu Santo. Storm clouds massed in the west, the air thick with salt and mist. Alongside him, Lieutenant James Collins, an American pilot from the 5th Bombardment Group, ran through final checks. Their mission, reconnaissance over the Solomon Islands, reporting enemy shipping movements and supply lines. 2 hours into the flight, flak erupted from a concealed battery. The Liberator shuddered violently as shells tore through the wings. Engines sputtered, alarms shrieked, and metal groaned under stress. Caldwell and Collins worked together to maintain altitude, but a final hit struck the fuselage near the fuel tanks. Fire spread quickly. The order to ditch was given. Airmen strapped into their seats, releasing their life vests for the first time in combat. The CO2 cartridges hissed and inflated the vests automatically as they entered the water, lifting them above the waves. Floating debris, crates, and sections of wing surrounded them. The Pacific was indifferent, vast, and relentless. Each man clung to the equipment that might make the difference between life and death. Caldwell observed that Collins' vest held firm despite a tear in the lining. The automatic inflation mechanism compensated for the damage. Several minutes later, other crew members surfaced from the same bomber, their vests deploying successfully despite punctures caused by jagged wreckage. The prototype, which had been dismissed in training exercises as potentially unreliable, had performed flawlessly. Throughout the day, the water swirled with remnants of the aircraft. Rescue coordination was slow but methodical. Allied naval units, alerted by radio and distress beacons, charted a course toward the survivors. Patrol boats and aircraft maintained a vigilant search, scanning for flashes of orange vests bobbing against the gray expanse. Despite intermittent enemy reconnaissance, the survivors remained largely unnoticed, protected by the immensity of the ocean and the stealth of early morning fog. For hours, the airmen floated. Some drifted tens of miles from the crash site. They shared rations, signaled with mirrors, and kept mental notes of drifting currents and floating debris. Each minute of waiting tested endurance and resolve, yet the vests and survival gear provided both buoyancy and a fragile sense of control. As night fell, distant fires from Japanese positions illuminated the horizon, a stark reminder that the war did not pause for their struggle. Yet in the quiet between artillery echoes and the lapping of waves, there was a moment of human persistence, a calm recognition that technology, combined with courage, had preserved them. By morning, Allied search planes spotted the survivors. They were lifted from the black water, tired, shivering, but alive. Their aircraft had been lost, but the gear designed to save life had performed beyond expectation. In the black waters, hope began to float. By 1944, the war had extended beyond fields and skies into the very heart of industry. The RAF's technological edge relied not only on pilots and planes, but on the hidden machinery of shadow factories, dispersed across Britain to evade Luftwaffe raids. These sites produced aircraft, engines, and survival equipment in secrecy, often underground or within camouflaged buildings, illuminated only by flickering bulbs and the occasional daylight from skylights hidden beneath tarpaulins. Among these factories, RAF Farnborough's experimental division oversaw the production of advanced pilot survival systems, including the newly refined ejection seat assemblies derived from the Mallory design. Engineers, many veterans of prior projects, worked in near-total isolation. Each blueprint, piston, and canopy release mechanism was numbered, coded, and cross-checked multiple times before assembly. Mistakes could cost lives, and leaks could cost the war. German intelligence understood this. The Abwehr had long maintained networks in England, targeting industrial and research facilities. Agents posed as laborers, clerks, or technicians. They recorded schedules, photographed blueprints, and attempted to gain access to the workshops. The RAF, aware of these threats, employed multiple countermeasures, double-coded correspondence, random shifts, and deliberately false schematics. In late spring 1944, a series of intercepted communications indicated that a spy had infiltrated a Coventry-based subfactory. Security teams quietly traced the source, a low-level clerk with access to assembly diagrams. Rather than arrest immediately, intelligence officers decided on a counterintelligence operation. They provided the agent with carefully constructed false blueprints, suggesting an alternate ejection seat design that relied on unstable spring mechanisms and impractical harness sequences. The documents were convincing. Technical jargon, detailed diagrams, and fabricated test data made them appear genuine. Within weeks, intercepted German reports confirmed the designs had been relayed to research centers in Berlin and Munich. Engineers there began preliminary trials, unaware that the entire sequence was engineered to fail. Meanwhile, inside the shadow factory, real production continued undisturbed. Engineers labored through nights of air raid sirens and the occasional concussion of distant bombs. Sparks flew across workbenches, engines tested in enclosed bays roared to life, and reports of successful test ejections reached supervisory officers. Yet outside, the enemy labored on wasted time, chasing a mirage of innovation. One evening, Lieutenant Colonel James Redford, head of security for the division, reviewed the latest intelligence debriefs. He noted with clinical detachment that the Germans had committed significant resources to replicating the false design. Documents included detailed projections of failure modes, projected altitudes, and even a mock survival analysis. None of it corresponded to reality. The enemy had been misled, investing weeks, perhaps months, in technology that would never leave the testing floor. The operation remained classified for decades. Only fragments of reports emerged post-war, buried within archives labeled Top Secret, Counterintelligence Operations. Within the shadow factory, life returned to its relentless rhythm, pistons, rivets, and the constant hum of machinery. No one celebrated. Success was measured in aircraft launched, pilots saved, and enemy plans derailed, silently, invisibly. By late 1944, production and innovation had reached a peak. Ejection seats, flotation devices, and pressurized cockpits were reliable and distributed across RAF squadrons. German spies, chasing false data, failed to close the technological gap. In the tunnels and hidden workshops, engineers leaned over blueprints, measuring, testing, and perfecting. The war of machines had become a war of minds, a chess game in which victory could be won not by firepower alone, but by foresight, deception, and secrecy. The false plan would remain a classified triumph, an invisible victory that shaped the skies without a single shot fired. The war had ended, but the sky did not forget. Over the battered airfields of southern England, dawn revealed empty runways scarred by years of relentless sorties, bombs, and training accidents. Cities lay in ruin, chimneys smoked faintly. The machinery of conflict had quieted, yet the hum of invention persisted, insistent and unyielding. Flight Officer Edward Mallory, survivor and reluctant legend, walked among hangars lined with prototypes of a new age. Gloucester Meteor jets, and experimental jet engine fighters whose sleek fuselages contrasted sharply with the canvas and wood biplanes he had flown decades earlier. The lessons of war were etched into every panel, every control surface, every instrument. But among the polished metal and roaring engines, one detail drew his attention above all else: the ejection seats. The device that had once failed him, sending him into the channel through a combination of misfire and luck, had been refined through years of iteration. Pistons were calibrated with precision, harnesses reinforced, and secondary canopy releases synchronized to ensure pilot safety at unprecedented speeds. What had been a fluke in 1940 was now a reliable instrument of survival. Mallory observed a test flight from the observation tower. A young pilot, unfamiliar with fear and aware only of procedure, engaged the system after an engine failure at high altitude. The seat discharged smoothly, lifting him clear of the aircraft, deploying the chute without hesitation. The pilot descended into a net of safety lines and foam padding, alive, unharmed, the culmination of years of human ingenuity and sacrifice. Below the runway, the shadows of destroyed hangars and flattened factories whispered of the cost that had made this moment possible. Every innovation had been purchased with blood. Engineers who died in experimental trials, pilots lost to misfired systems, and countless civilians caught in the expansion of industrial warfare. Yet the perfected ejection seat embodied hope, the fragile assertion that even amid devastation, human life could be preserved. Beyond the airfield, the world was waking to the implications of technology unchecked. Atomic detonations over Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated the devastating reach of human invention. Mallory walked among test aircraft with a somber awareness. These jets were the beginning of another era, one in which speed and altitude could no longer conceal the permanence of human ambition or error. Survival devices were no longer mere tools for the battlefield. They were symbolic markers of responsibility. He recalled the Channel waters of 1940, the cold, the silence, the improbability of life, and recognized in that memory the origin of every precaution taken now. Every piston, every strap, every gas cartridge traced its lineage to that single, chaotic flight. Without it, countless pilots might have been lost before the dawn of the jet age. The air was quiet, almost reverent. Engines roared briefly in test runs, then fell silent. Mallory noted the sunrise reflecting off polished fuselages, light glinting against a new era of possibility, tempered by the memory of failure. In that glow, he saw the continuum of war and peace, the evolution of aircraft, the refinement of survival systems, and the enduring struggle to balance innovation with mortality. A young test pilot landed safely, removed his helmet, and saluted the observation tower. Mallory returned the gesture, not as command, but as acknowledgement. The system that had once betrayed him had now become its own guardian, saving another in the same sky that had nearly claimed him. Humanity had mastered flight, but lost control of fear. The war had ended, yet the work never truly ceased. By the early 1950s, the world had settled into uneasy tension. Europe and the Pacific lay in ruins, but innovation pressed forward, now driven by the specter of a new conflict, the Cold War. Test flights over deserts and Arctic tundras replaced dogfights. Pressure chambers and rocket sleds substituted for trenches. Survival technology, once designed to save pilots from burning Spitfires, was now being adapted to jet bombers and high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. Flight Officer Edward Mallory, now in his mid-30s, had left combat behind but remained indispensable to the RAF. His experience with experimental ejection systems and survival prototypes made him a consultant for the design of V-bombers and long-range jets. He observed pilots undergoing tests in hypobaric chambers, where simulated altitudes exceeded 50,000 feet. Breathing apparatuses, pressurized suits, and rapid deploy ejection seats were evaluated with the cold precision of science. Each test recorded acceleration, pulse, and oxygen saturation. Human endurance became data, a line in a spreadsheet. Yet beyond the technical rigor, a quieter cost persisted. Pilots who had survived combat often carried psychological scars, sudden tremors during high-speed dives, panic when seats fired, and survivor guilt that could not be measured in pounds per square inch. Engineers like Mallory noted these reactions clinically, documenting them in reports that would remain classified for decades. Many of the men avoided personal reflection, and those who did spoke in fragmented anecdotes of crashes, ditchings, and improbable rescues. Mallory himself found the work increasingly surreal. He walked sterile corridors lined with observation rooms, where one-way mirrors reflected the tension of pilots strapped into test rigs. Intercoms crackled with commands and feedback, each voice precise and detached. Outside, the desert wind swept over abandoned runways and sandblasted hangars, carrying the faint echo of wartime engines that no longer roared. In reviewing archival data for a new ejection seat prototype, Mallory encountered an anomaly. The field reports from August 1940, documenting his own crash and improbable survival over the English Channel, were absent. The logs he remembered reading as a young officer, detailed accounts of ejection sequence, harness malfunction, and wind tunnel comparisons, had been removed from the official record. Only secondary analyses remained, generic test summaries referencing previous pilot survival cases without identifying him. He confirmed with a fellow archivist that the original data had been classified and then erased, as if the incident had never occurred. The misfiring system, the nearly fatal malfunction, the very event that had guided decades of life-saving design, had been stripped of its human author. For the first time, Mallory considered the impersonal machinery of history, a man who had fallen from the sky, and yet whose existence in that moment had been deliberately obscured. The revelation unsettled him more than any test flight or fireball in the channel. Engineers and pilots were now measured entirely as data points, their experiences sterilized into blueprints and performance charts. The memory of near death, once vivid, had been reduced to a cautionary note for other designers. He left the lab that evening, walking past dormant jets lined like sentinels in the fading light. The desert was silent, empty of human life, but full of history carried in metal and wire. Somewhere, deep in classified archives, lay the proof of his survival, a record of defiance against the sky, yet invisible to the world he had served. He began searching for proof he ever fell from the sky. The sky had ceased to be merely a battlefield. By the 1960s, it had become a laboratory, a proving ground for humanity's ambition to leave Earth entirely. The jet age had matured into the space race, and with it, the question of survival transcended combat. Pilots were now astronauts, seated in capsules where the difference between life and death was measured in seconds, pressure differentials, and mechanical reliability. The lineage of these systems traced back decades to designs conceived in the chaos of wartime. Ejection seats, once crude assemblies of pistons and compressed air, had evolved into escape capsules capable of propelling a man safely from high-speed aircraft or a failing spacecraft. Pressurized suits, oxygen systems, and shock-absorbing harnesses were refinements of equipment first tested in the RAF during the Battle of Britain. The improvisation that had once saved Flight Officer Edward Mallory had become the foundation for an entire branch of aerospace safety engineering. In a NASA laboratory in Houston, engineers reviewed historical schematics of ejection and capsule systems, comparing acceleration tolerances, canopy release sequences, and restraint harness designs. Across pages of archival blueprints, the same principles were evident: stage propulsion, shock absorption, and redundancy. Notes from British engineers, originally classified, had been declassified in fragments and incorporated into modern designs. One annotated sketch bore an almost illegible reference to Channel Survival Incident, 1940. It was here that Mallory's name resurfaced. A footnote in a NASA memo read, "Consider lineage of survival systems. Mallory, E. RAF, 1940, prototype ejection system test. Data informs capsule harness sequence and emergency deployment timing." The reference was brief, almost incidental, yet it carried the weight of history. A man who had fallen through the skies, nearly forgotten by official record, was now cited as a technical ancestor to the safety of men orbiting Earth. The engineers ran simulations. Capsules were subjected to extreme velocities, sudden depressurization, and reentry stress testing. Systems deployed automatically, inflating cushions and separating sections of the capsule with the precision of decades of iterative learning. Each innovation, once forged under duress in wartime hangars, had been refined for astronauts traveling beyond the stratosphere. The laboratories themselves carried the echo of earlier decades. Metallic hums from hydraulic testing rigs were punctuated by the faint whir of fans maintaining cleanroom environments. Test dummies, weighted with instruments, hung suspended in rigs designed to replicate zero gravity and high G-forces. Engineers observed readings with cold attention, pulse analogs, structural integrity, and shock dissipation. Every calculation reminded them of the fragility of life and of the human stories embedded in each mechanism. Mallory, now retired, visited a demonstration of one such capsule. He watched as a mock ejection occurred. The seats separated smoothly, cushions inflated, and the dummy floated clear, fully protected. The machinery performed flawlessly, an evolution of the device that had once betrayed him over the English Channel. For a moment, the weight of decades of trial and loss hung in his chest. A system born of error had matured into certainty. Outside, the night sky stretched over Houston, stars faint against the city lights. Somewhere beyond Earth, capsules and astronauts orbited silently, safeguarded by principles forged in fire and refined through human perseverance. Mallory traced the lineage of every mechanism back to himself, to that improbable survival, to the fluke of misfiring pistons and wind over the channel. The memo, tucked in a NASA archive, ensured that his name persisted, a faint echo of 1940, reaching beyond atmosphere and time. A ghost from 1940 had reached orbit. By the late 20th century, warfare had begun to shed its human immediacy. The Cold War had left the world perched on the edge of annihilation, and the specter of nuclear conflict lingered over bunkers and airfields long after the last missile tests. Military strategy had shifted from boots on the ground to satellites in orbit, encrypted transmissions, and simulations designed to prepare for conflicts that might never come. In the 1980s, NATO and Warsaw Pact exercises modeled nuclear exchanges, testing response protocols under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Pilots trained in flight simulators that recreated every conceivable emergency: engine failure, missile strikes, and cabin depressurization. Each program recorded human reactions to stress, measuring decision-making speed, physiological tolerance, and survival probability. The lessons of World War II, once carried in journals and field reports, were now coded into software. By the 1990s, autonomous systems began to take over the first line of response. Unmanned drones replaced reconnaissance flights. Stealth aircraft operated with minimal human oversight. Ejection seats, flotation devices, and harnesses were no longer solely physical interventions. Their logic was abstracted into algorithms. Engineers at defense laboratories in Houston and Farnborough traced the principles of pilot preservation back to historical incidents, including the improbable survival of Flight Officer Edward Mallory in 1940. One AI prototype, designated Guardian X, was explicitly designed to prioritize survival. It monitored cockpit data, atmospheric conditions, and pilot vitals, calculating the exact moment to eject or engage automated emergency procedures. Every decision it made was informed by decades of empirical trial and human error. The system's code included conditional logic that reflected a moral imperative: always preserve the pilot, regardless of mission parameters. In this way, a machine inherited a principle born in chaos, error, and misfiring pistons decades earlier. Simulations ran in vast darkened rooms, banks of screens glowing against the walls. Analysts watched trajectories, sensor data, and event logs as drones executed maneuvers, sometimes crashing, sometimes evading hypothetical strikes. The atmosphere was mechanical calm, no explosions, no smoke, only digital readouts scrolling across monitors. Satellites orbited silently above, cataloging movements across continents and oceans. In one test scenario, Guardian X faced simultaneous threats: engine failure, missile targeting, and rapidly deteriorating weather. The AI initiated a series of emergency protocols, prioritizing survival over mission completion. Ejection sequences deployed perfectly. The system calculated altitude, wind drift, and trajectory, ensuring the pilot dummy would reach safety. Analysts noted the uncanny accuracy. The software's decisions mirrored human instinct, refined through decades of observation and iteration. Meanwhile, decommissioned Cold War bunkers sat abandoned beneath frozen landscapes, their consoles dark, yet the logic developed within them persisted. The code carried memory of human hesitation, risk, and improvisation. Every pilot saved in simulation was a testament not only to algorithmic precision, but to the invisible lineage of wartime ingenuity, from WWII's experimental ejection seats to modern autonomous guardians. By the year 2000, the world had entered a digital battlefield where human presence was often optional, yet survival remained central. Machines could calculate threats in microseconds, but embedded in the code was a principle distilled from history. Human life, once tested and nearly lost, must always be preserved. In the machine's code, the ghost of a human choice remained. By 2040, the echoes of centuries of conflict had quieted, leaving humanity to rebuild amid the ruins of its own ambitions. Cities were reconstructed, skies cleared of smoke, and once secret military installations converted into museums and research facilities. Yet some fragments of history remained hidden, buried within digital archives, storage vaults, and the fragile remnants of physical machinery. In a reconstructed hangar at the Imperial War Museum, a team of aerospace historians carefully unwrapped a Spitfire cockpit frame, corroded but intact. Its centerpiece, the original ejection seat mechanism, had lain in storage since the late 20th century, unexamined due to classification restrictions. Alongside it was Flight Officer Edward Mallory's original flight logs, meticulously preserved on paper and encoded discs. For decades, fragments of his story had been obscured, partially erased from RAF archives, leaving only faint references in technical manuals and classified reports. The researchers began their forensic reconstruction. Pistons, harnesses, and release valves were cataloged, then compared with modern ejection seat designs. Every misaligned component, scorched joint, and worn spring was analyzed with precision. The mechanism, long thought to have failed accidentally during Mallory's 1940 ejection over the Channel, revealed an unexpected truth. Hidden within the device's housing, engineers discovered a manual override, a small, nearly imperceptible adjustment in the piston release sequence. Examination of Mallory's log confirmed the discovery. He had tinkered with the system before takeoff, adjusting the sequence to compensate for potential engine failure. His annotations, written in the clinical, detached style of wartime documentation, noted contingencies, timings, and personal intuition. The malfunction that had saved him was not entirely mechanical accident. It was deliberate, a human intervention guided by instinct, knowledge, and foresight. The historical significance rippled through the research team. For decades, Mallory had been recorded as a statistical anomaly, an improbable survivor whose experience shaped ejection seat design through happenstance. Yet now the evidence was clear. He had rewired fate. Every piston misfire, every harness delay, and every moment of apparent luck had been calculated by the pilot himself. Digital archives corroborated the physical evidence. Original RAF reports, declassified after decades, included test notes, field sketches, and early blueprints. Cross-referenced with Mallory's personal logs, the reconstruction painted a coherent picture. An experimental system, initially rejected by superiors, had been refined not by engineers alone, but by the insight of a man confronting mortality. The cockpit became a laboratory of human ingenuity, a nexus where instinct intersected with engineering, producing results that machines alone could not achieve. Outside the hangar, holographic exhibits displayed the lineage of survival systems, from Mallory's Spitfire seat to modern astronaut escape capsules and AI-controlled emergency protocols. Curators emphasized the technical evolution, but the team understood the deeper narrative. Survival had been human first, mechanical second. Technology had been guided by an individual's courage, foresight, and adaptability. For the first time, the museum's visitors could see not only the mechanics but the human story embedded within them. The very apparatus that had once seemed to fail now testified to deliberate action, to the quiet brilliance of a pilot who had mastered his own odds. In the final analysis, the team concluded with reverence. Mallory's survival was not luck. Every piston, every release, every moment in the channel had been shaped by human decision. Instinct translated into engineering, life preserved through conscious intervention. He didn't survive by luck. He rewired fate. Dawn broke over the airbase, pale lights spilling across rows of sleek, modern jets. Engines hummed softly in the morning chill, a mechanical heartbeat echoing centuries of evolution. On the tarmac, Flight Lieutenant Daniel Harper ran a final inspection of his aircraft, noting the intricate network of sensors, reinforced seats, and emergency ejection systems. Every component was a product of decades of trial, failure, and refinement. A silent lineage stretching back to Flight Officer Edward Mallory and the improbable survival that had begun the journey. Harper paused beside the cockpit, tracing a finger along the polished canopy frame. He remembered reading Mallory's story in a historical dossier during training. The pilot who had fallen through the skies over the channel in 1940, surviving a misfired ejection that should have ended his life. The tale was legendary in aviation circles, a study in ingenuity, courage, and the unpredictable marriage of human instinct and mechanical design. Every safety system in Harper's jet carried echoes of that history. The modern ejection seat could operate flawlessly at supersonic speeds, the restraint harnesses adjusted to microseconds, and flotation devices inflated automatically in the event of water landings. Yet Harper felt, in the quiet before takeoff, the continuity of something more profound than engineering. The human will to survive, the instinct that had guided Mallory's hands as he rewired fate in that fragile cockpit over the channel. The airbase itself seemed to hold its breath. Winds rustled the edges of hangar doors. Distant birds traced invisible lines across the pale sky. Harper performed his checks deliberately, systematically, yet his thoughts drifted through the centuries. Steam-powered airships of the late 19th century, canvas biplanes dueling over the Somme, experimental ejection seats tested in secret factories, and astronauts floating in capsules once inspired by wartime improvisation. The arc of history stretched behind him, from fire and smoke to quiet steel and glass. Each innovation built on the triumphs and mistakes of those who had come before. He climbed into the cockpit, strapping himself in with the practiced care of a pilot who knew both the limits of the machine and the fragility of life. The instruments blinked to life, displaying altitude projections, emergency protocols, and automated safety sequences. He ran through the pre-flight checklist, noting the redundancy of each system, the decades of refinement encoded in every piston and sensor. Above all, he thought of Mallory, the man who had survived not because of perfection, but because of instinct, courage, and an intimate understanding of his own mortality. The engines roared, low at first, then rising to a crescendo as the jet taxied toward the runway. Harper's reflection in the canopy merged with the sky, past and present intertwined in the muted light. Black and white memories of history flickered in his mind. Wartime hangars, shadowed factories, ocean waves carrying life vests, and finally, capsules reaching orbit. Slowly, faint color bled into the scene, the present embracing the legacy of the past. As he lifted into the air, the wind and the hum of turbines surrounded him. The centuries of innovation were present in every second of ascent, every mechanical safeguard, every precaution born from the mistakes of men long gone. He felt the weight of history beneath his wings, and with it, the quiet assurance that survival, ingenuity, and courage remained inseparable from the act of flight. Harper glanced at the horizon, the pale sun spilling over distant mountains. In that instant, the story of a single pilot from 1940 resonated with every flight, every life saved, every invention perfected through trial and sacrifice. He understood, as every pilot before him had understood, that the machine was only part of the equation. The other part, the most essential, was the human will to endure. From the trenches to the stars, humanity's greatest invention was never the machine. It was the will to live. Edward Mallory's story proves that the greatest inventions of war are not machines, but the human will to survive. From the skies over the channel to spacebound capsules, his legacy lives on in every pilot who walks away from danger. If you were amazed by this tale of ingenuity and courage, hit like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell, because the next secret of war is just around the corner.